Well, good evening. Welcome to our continuing conversations around human sexuality and especially General Conference 2019. I wanted to introduce to you our guest tonight. Kim Ingram, our conference secretary, has been with us before, so I know you'll remember her and welcome her. And tonight, we have also joining us Jennifer Burton Lineberry. She was also a delegate to General Conference, and so the format for tonight that we'll loosely follow is that they're going to show us some slides and make an overall presentation around General Conference and just afterward. And then they'll make some individual reflections about their time at conference and whatever they'd like to share. And then we'd love to be able to entertain your questions. So we have microphones here, and we'll do our best to get to them. And if we run out of time or can't come up with an answer between the three of us, we'll be glad to take those questions and get back to you if we have name and a contact information piece, and we'll get information to you. So thanks for being here. Our rules for tonight are that we don't have a lot of them, just that we'll be kind and courteous and open to everybody so that people can get their questions asked and answered. And we've been so blessed over these last almost 2 years, I realized the other day, of having these conversations that we've been able to, I think, be a model congregation and what it means to be able to have serious conversation, deep conversation, but to do it within guidelines of courtesy and care and love for one another. So I thank you for that ahead of time for the way I know tonight will go. So if you'd allow me to open us, let me open in prayer this evening. Gracious and loving God, this has been such a beautiful day, and we are so blessed here in the Carolinas to have blue skies and green grass and flowers, to have seasons around the year, and this is just one of the most beautiful ones in all of creation, is this time of year. So I hope that each and every person within the sound of my voice has had a great day, whether it was at work or at home or out in the community. And now we've come apart from the world, God, to come into your house to share some important conversations around things that matter to us and matter to the world and matter to the people around us. So be here with us and among us, God. Guide our conversations. Give us creativity and imagination and grace and forgiveness wherever it might be needed. So God, may tonight be a great night of open hearts and open minds, that we might hear and receive messages from our guests tonight and from one another, and to do that in a way that brings honor and glory to your name and to your kingdom on earth. Amen. Well, let me turn it over to Kim and to Jennifer and let them take the lead.
Good evening. It's good to be here tonight. If you were here when I was here last time, I was here also with Jennifer, different Jennifer. Mm-hmm. Ironically, all three of us worked together for a while, and so I just go places with Jennifers, and then I only have to remember one name, and we're good to go. Jennifer and I have been friends for a long time, and are delighted to be here tonight. I appreciate that you've taken the time on what I know has been a busy day and a busy week, and what is always in May a busy month, in order to come and learn more about the United Methodist Church and where we are, where we've been, what some of the decisions that were made by the General Conference session and the implications of some of those. So thank you for that. It really is exciting that you're invested enough in your church, but not only in Matthews United Methodist Church, but what it means to be part of a connectional system, that you would take the time and come and be a part of that. So we're going to kind of go back and forth a little bit, and then, as Craig said, did I just do that? Okay. As Paul said, I bet I'm not the only one that's ever done that. As Paul said, we're going to allow you to have some feedback and some conversation at the end. So I wanted to talk, and you can go on to the next slide, just a minute about General Conference. Oh, do you mind doing those for us? Okay, thank you. So as you probably know, we met in February for really what was, and I'll talk about that in a second, really 4 days of meetings. We were there for 5 or 6, but we met together for about 4 days in St. Louis. My hotel was right next to the arch, and so you'll see a couple pictures of the arch because I went by at different times of the day and I took different pictures of it. That's not that was a good thing that came out of it, and it was a beautiful experience and opportunity. And so we gathered as a delegation, and there were about 850 of us all together that came together. And just a bit of a reminder, so in 2016, almost all the same people who were delegates to the General Conference in 2016 were also the delegates to the General Conference in 2019. At 2016, we stopped what we were doing. We passed kind of a petition or resolution that said we were going to halt our conversations about homosexuality at the time, and all of the legislation on the table we would not act on. We would form a Way Forward Commission. They would meet for a couple years. They would make a couple of proposals to this General Conference session, and we would begin to act on those. So not only did 3 proposals come out of the Way Forward Commission or related to that, but then other entities could submit legislation to the General Conference meeting. Ahead of time, the Commission on General Conference, another committee, decided what was appropriate to the task for this specifically called General Conference session. They threw out some of the legislation that they said wasn't really related to what this called session was supposed to be about, and then we received and discussed the rest of the legislation. So that's just kind of the really, in a nutshell, history of how we got to St. Louis and what we were talking about in 2019. So
and if you're really a metho nerd, it's the Committee on Reference.
That's right. The Committee on Reference decided what we would discuss and what we wouldn't discuss. And next slide. So we spent 4 days, and interestingly, the first day was prayer and preparation. We spent hours on Saturday in kind of guided and directed prayer times. We prayed for all of the different areas of the world in which the United Methodist Church is represented. We prayed for the process and the delegates and really spent a good long time in prayer. There were prayer stations set up, and at breaks and at lunch, we went around to the prayer stations and prayed. And then we kind of got things going with some of the instructions and that kind of thing later in the day. On Sunday, we began to get things in order. And decide in what order we would consider the legislation. We did that by voting. Our voting was on electronic devices that were anonymous or private, so that we could vote and nobody recorded who voted how, or nobody knew who voted how. And so used that process to decide in what order we were going to talk about the legislation. In the process of it, it was significant because it gave us an idea really of what the priorities might be and how we would consider it. And we got started on the legislation that day and considered one package of petitions that we'll talk about in a minute. Then on Monday, we became a legislative committee. So normally at General Conference, we would divide into a bunch of committees, deal with legislation, bring it back as either on a consent calendar or it failed. Anyway, at this General Conference, they decided we would only act as one legislative committee. The reason I'm telling you this is because on Monday, we had to make decisions on all the legislation, and then on Tuesday, we had to do it all over again. So that was just kind of an interesting process the way it turned out. So on Monday, we started with the traditional plan, and then we looked at what have been called the exit plans. They actually are called disaffiliation plans, but they've been referenced as exit plans. Then we looked at the One Church plan, and then somebody made a motion we dismiss all the rest of the legislation, which is really many of the other things that people had submitted. And that passed except for the simple plan. The simple plan was lifted out of that motion. We passed, so we did not end up talking about all the legislation, but we did kind of the big chunks of it. And so we did discuss the simple plan. At the end of that day, we were done with the legislative committee. We had done what was required, which was to make some kind of decision on every piece of legislation. And on Tuesday, we then became the plenary body who made the same group of people, different role. We became the plenary body who then had to make decisions about final decisions. And
let me add just a little bit. With that legislative committee, a lot of what we did was go ahead and try to put in amendments to those petitions that we knew we would talk about the next day, so that they became more perfected. So if we wanted to then on Tuesday approve that one as it is, then that would give us those amendments already in there. So that way, if there was something from another plan that we wanted to put into one another, so that we got everything like we wanted it, that's when that happened. It was on Monday.
And what you may remember is ahead of time, some of the legislation had already been determined that it was unconstitutional. Some of the plans had we already knew going into it that there were certain pieces of it that would not match up with or abide by our Constitution and the Book of Discipline. And so those were some of the amendments that we did, but we didn't get it all done that day. So then we knew if things were going to pass on Tuesday and be constitutional, some other changes had to be made. So on Tuesday, we started kind of in the same order again. We approved the West Path petitions, and we'll look at those in a second. And then we had a minority report, and some of this is just interesting how legislation works in the church, because I think it really works very similarly to how it does in the government. I probably made this comment before, but because the United Methodist Church, well, it was the Methodist Church then in the United States, grew up at the same time our country grew up, our churches, the way our church operates kind of mirrors how our government operates, which is just sort of fascinating. And sometimes not very helpful, but it is how it works. So we had a minority report to the traditional plan. If it had passed, then we would have looked at it instead of the traditional plan. It was bringing the one church plan back for consideration, but it failed. So then we looked at the traditional plan. We spent some time perfecting that, and then the bishop who was presiding at the time agreed, after somebody made a motion, that we would be done with the traditional plan. And it passed in full as it was written and amended at that moment. And I tell you that, and I'll just tell you this now so we kind of don't forget. Because of that, some of it was still unconstitutional. It had not all been fully amended to become at least what people thought could be constitutional. We made, I don't know, a few amendments, but more were needed in order for it to become constitutional. And because of that, some of it held and some of it didn't in the long run. And then we also looked at one of the exit plans that actually had been amended the day before. And we'll look at that in a minute because it passed and has been determined as constitutional. So that's kind of how the process worked. We had a hard deadline at 6:30, I think it was. We had to adjourn. There was a monster truck show coming in the next day, and they had to fill the whole place with sand and bring in the monster trucks. And so we had been told that hard and fast we had to adjourn at that time, and therefore we did.
It's a true story, because if we didn't get out, we were going to be rushed out with the monster trucks.
So one more slide. And this is the Western North Carolina delegation, at least those of us who were at dinner together on the last night. It is most of us. You'll see there's some diversity in the group. It also includes some of our alternates. Every day, our delegation, which were 10 laity, 10 clergy, and then our alternates, as well as we had a number of pages and ushers and observers. We gathered twice a day for devotional and prayer time. So we stayed very closely connected with one another. We supported each other kind of through the whole process, even though we felt differently and we knew we voted differently. We really were well connected with one another through the whole experience. Okay, now we'll talk about what passed and what it means.
We're ready to dive into this. Well, the first thing that did come out of General Conference, and it was the first thing that everybody said was the first priority, we need to get this accomplished. And because I work with the board and it's sitting on their audit committee, this is near and dear to my heart with WestPath. And that was the petitions for what related to the pensions liability and how that would be handled with any plan, with any church wanting to leave, with any pastor wanting to leave. Even before General Conference, we had a number of churches and a number of pastors who had already been wanting to pull out. I know down in Mississippi, having talked with David Stotts, the treasurer down there, going into General Conference, he already had 13 churches who were in the process or had declared that they wanted to leave the United Methodist Church. So with each one, he was trying to negotiate, figure out what kind of pension numbers, what kind of property numbers, et cetera, et cetera. So we knew we needed to get this type of petition in. So what we did, we had two petitions, one for churches, one for clergy. And basically, what you see on the screen, the exiting churches will pay their fair share of an unfunded future pension liability. WestPath will supply that number based on a market basis to the annual conference. The annual conference determines how it gets allocated to any particular church. That can be on an apportionment decimal formula. It can be based on membership. It could be based on the revenues, as some people do their apportionments, just however that conference decides to do that. That unfunded liability is really the part that's the tail. A lot of what we already have for current is funded, but we need to look at that whole mortality out, as some of the WestPath graphs would show, to 2099 for the pastors. For the clergy themselves, if you were an active clergy who has already an account that you're building up, whether it's the pre-82, the CRISP plan, any parts of that, They said, you're going to still have your account. We're not getting rid of it. We're not throwing it out the door. You still have that money that you have earned. But what we're going to do is transfer that to an account much like a 403B that you have with the current UMPIP now, so that it becomes more self-managed. It will still be at Westpath if that's where you want to leave it, but you have more of the direction of where that's invested at, because it will be in a separate pool of money away from everybody else who's still in the United Methodist Church. So what that does is basically it limits the liability that will come to the church or to the conference later. What you've earned is still there. It's just you make it grow on your own by what you tell Westpath how you want to manage it, and can still use any parts of their life stage processes. One amendment was added to these, and for a while there we thought, oh no, don't do that, because the way the amendment came in at first, it would have messed the entire thing up. So there's several of us who got together from the Westpath board, and we said, okay, can we reconsider this amendment? Talked directly to the maker, gave them a little bit of a suggestion as to how this might work for what they wanted, and they said, yes, that's okay. We reconsidered, and this is the amendment we added, was to say that nothing in these petitions prevents an annual conference from collecting any other obligations, because that was the first thought, that this was the only thing that any conference would pay or any church would pay. It's like, no. So we just added the language to make sure that's clear. This was to be effective immediately at the close of General Conference. Many times when we pass legislation, it's a year late or the beginning of the next year before it comes in to be in effect. This one was asked to be in effect immediately, especially because the situations of churches already asking to move out and clergy already asking to move out. So that was the petitions for that. Probably the only ones that passed by a huge majority as we went through the day. So next then we started into the traditional plan. And the first thing we looked at was the petition regarding the definition of homosexuality. This, as you see it on the screen, is actually the final language that came out of this. And the part in italics is the part that was added. So it's added to the definition, or is living in a same-sex marriage, domestic partnership, or civil union, or is a person who publicly states she or he is a practicing homosexual. This, just like any other petition, would be effective a year after, so January 1st, 2020. This one was declared constitutional, and essentially was just adding some language in for some issues that had come up in past different trials and charges and various things like that. So that was where we changed the definition. Then we moved on to the petition for episcopal responsibilities. And here is where we started really some of the changes in anything that was in the Book of Discipline. In this particular petition, the bishops are now prohibited from consecrating bishops who are self-avowed practicing homosexuals. Bishops are prohibited from commissioning candidates that the Board of Ordained Ministry has determined to be self-avowed practicing homosexuals. That is a very long term and hard to say. Or if they have failed to certify through an examination, not just for any type of human sexuality issues or anything like that, but just if they did not go through the full thorough examination, they were prohibited from being commissioned. They're also being prohibited from ordaining deacons or elders that the Board of Ordained Ministry has determined is a self-avowed practicing homosexual. So commissioning or ordination is what's picked up in this particular petition. Now you'll see that the words practicing are highlighted in red. When these petitions first came through, that word was missing. We have a committee on correlation and editorial revisions who looks at all the petitions after they're passed, and in this case, after Judicial Council has looked at them, and basically looks for them to be edited into the discipline, making sure they're not in conflict with anything else or with themselves. In this particular case, this came through to them as just self-avowed homosexual, missing the word practicing. So, and in some other instances, the word self-avowed was missing. So they went in and they made the editorial changes to put those words back in, because it wasn't the intent of those petitions to have them removed. It was purely an error as the petitions were brought forward and published. So that's had some press in the last couple of days. So I just wanted to make sure that you guys knew what that was all about.
So one of the things that, or two things I'm going to mention just for clarity. One is that the traditional plan doesn't change much about our current book of discipline, like what the stances of the current book of discipline are. What it really does is close some loopholes that annual conferences and colleges of bishops, boards of ordained ministry, different groups have found loopholes or taken advantage of language in a particular way. So what the traditional plan has really done, a lot of people call it putting teeth. What it is really kind of defining and making more specific these kind of things. The other thing I was going to mention is the Judicial Council met at the end of April to determine the constitutionality. But they also met several times while we were at General Conference, and they would come back and report, and then we would continue with our work. And in the end, the Judicial Council pretty much upheld all the things that we being like the church, I mean not we, but just that had been understood to be constitutional, indeed was constitutional, and the things that we thought would not be constitutional were not constitutional. So the truth is, the Judicial Council's decisions at the end of April didn't really change much. It just really clarified the work that had been done. Now, there were people and there were briefs that had been written to the Judicial Council, which operates like a Supreme Court, that there was the possibility, people thought, that they would throw out the traditional plan. And the reason people thought that, or even advocated for it, was because it was a plan as a whole, and there were some precedents, people thought, that either the plan was constitutional or it wasn't, that it couldn't be divided up into pieces to say some is, some isn't, therefore we'll keep some, we won't keep some. But that didn't happen. The Judicial Council didn't do that. So that's kind of what the big waiting to see what the Judicial Council would do at the end of April we were wondering about, and in the end, their decisions didn't really change much of what the actions of the General Conference were as we knew them to be.
There was only one that surprised us. We'll talk about that one at the end. It really surprised me.
So we'll go to the next slide. Trial court penalties. So the process when somebody files a complaint, so I'll give you kind of an example. If a pastor does a wedding for a gay couple, and somebody thinks that was a bad idea, they file what is called a complaint. They don't complain about it. They file a complaint, which is a written statement. I mean, it's an official kind of thing that they give to the bishop. And then there is a process outlined in the Book of Discipline of what the bishop has to do with a complaint. And the first action involves just resolution, where they try to come to a resolution between the parties and come out with something that both can agree to in the end. When that doesn't work out is when we get toward trial courts. So when that doesn't work out, then the bishop may hand it off to, I always forget what it's called. It's the person that acts like the...
Complainant?
No, the counsel for the church. The bishop hands it off to the counsel for the church, and that process then is out of the bishop's hands, and it moves toward a court or a court process. And so this decision is only if there has been, I'm still forgetting the language. Yeah, what they call a trial court. If there has been a court, which is the jury in a court process in the church are clergy, the peers of the person who the complaint was filed against. If there is a conviction, so if they find him guilty, and we use a lot of the regular court language, which a little bit makes my skin crawl to use it. But if there is a conviction after there has been a court process, then that says that conducting ceremonies which celebrate homosexual unions or performing same-sex ceremonies, the trial court does not have the power to and may not fix a penalty less than. So the minimum penalty, once somebody has been convicted through a trial court process, is the first time they get 1 year of suspension without pay, And the second year, no less than terminating their conference membership and revocation of their credentials. I did this presentation not long ago, and there seemed to be some misunderstanding. Some people were under the impression that if you've been charged with it, these are the penalties. But these are the penalties only if there has been a court process and you've been found guilty through that process. That process is expensive, it's timely, and it's complicated. In my memory, and I think this is right, we've not ever done one in the Western North Carolina Conference. There are some conferences in the jurisdiction who have done multiple, but it's not something that happens often. A bishop really tries to move toward a just resolution and not have to go through a trial process for this. Okay, sorry, that was kind of long. Next one. So this one's more in my wheelhouse. This is kind of what I do on a daily basis, and that's the qualifications for ministry and what the minimum requirements are. So the DCOM is the District Committee on Ministry. The BOM is the Board of Ordained Ministry. So at the district level, it's the committee that certifies candidates for ministry and approves local pastors for licensing. The Board of Ordained Ministry makes the decisions about commissioning to provisional membership and ordination. And they may not approve or recommend a person for any of those relationships with the annual conference who doesn't meet the qualifications based on full examinations and inquiry into the person's fitness. And then the bishop presiding cannot, if the Board of Ordained Ministry were to do that, to license or recommend ordination or provisional membership, then the bishop has to say, no, we're not going to do that, and rules it out of order. Now, this was the part I was going to look up, but from memory, so what paragraph 304, 1 to 3 are really the qualifications for ordination. It is a long and arduous process to become ordained in the United Methodist Church. Corey Millett did that with you all most recently, one of your clergy. And we do a psychological assessment, there's a medical report, there are recommendations from a seminary professor, from some kind of supervisory relationship, there's a background check, a credit check. You answer all these questions, you meet for an hour and a half with people who are going to ask you questions verbally. Like that 304.1 through 3 is a very long and involved process for ministry. And it already is. So our Board of Ordained Ministry will have to talk about whether they'll make any changes to any of that, but I would say that there already is a full examination and inquiry into someone's fitness for ministry, the way it currently works. And then the next one, please, is the complaint process. So this is back where I was talking about complaints, that if a bishop has received a complaint within 90 days, he or she must carry out the supervisory response. So that's the supervisory, what they have to do. If resolution is not achieved, then the bishop must either dismiss the complaint as having no basis in law or fact. That bold is what got added, with consent of cabinet, copies in the clergy person's file, and then the second piece, and shared with the complainant, got added, or refer it to the council for the church. Those two bolded pieces, one is that the bishop, before this, was able to make a decision but did not have to tell the person who filed the complaint what his or her decision was, and now they have to share that with a complainant. And bishops would dismiss complaints kind of based on their own interpretation, and what this says is if there's any basis in law or fact, the bishop can't do that. So those were the additions that were made to the book, the process.
Now, if we move on to the next one, it goes again in this whole just resolution process. And in this one, if I remember correctly, was a whole new part of the just resolution process. But it's that through that process, that it shall be stated all of the identified harms that have happened and how they are to be addressed by the church, the denominational church, which will be the conference, and other parties to the complaint, so that everyone has a fair idea of what's going on, what has happened, and how it's being handled. Kind of short and sweet, but it involves a lot whenever it's put into practice. The next one is also related through this just resolution process. And this one says that no matter where in the process a just resolution is achieved, is completed, is determined what that would be, the complainant will be a party to that decision. In the past, some of those have just been closed. The complainant who made the charge may never know about what happened and how it was set aside, but this makes that happen so that they will know. And as it says, with every effort that the complainant will agree with that same just resolution that has been decided. And then last but not least, on my part for now, with the appeals process. And I think this was the end of what we put in to change anything about the traditional plan and where our discipline was right now. This one says that if we have a finding of fact in one of these trial courts, that no appeal is going to be necessary because that's pretty much set in stone. However, we do have a right to appeal that as the church to the Committee on Appeals and then to the Judicial Council if an egregious church law error has been made. Now, nothing really defines that at this point, but if it was an egregious error, something pretty big, not just simple procedural type things as we talked about it in our sessions. But if those errors are found, we can then ask for an appeal of that ruling, remand the case for a new trial completely. Just start all over again to make that happen rather than like some mistrial, that kind of thing. So this was added at the appeal to the Judicial Council when there's an investigation or no trial as well. So if somebody just investigates but didn't make anything happen with it, then this can also have an appeal added for that. So a few more things that will actually provide some protection to the clergy.
Okay. So that was the end of the traditional plan. Now this is the exit plan that passed. As I said, it's called disaffiliation, but usually they were referenced as exit plans. I think there were seven different items of legislation that presented different kind of exit plan possibilities. And indeed, in the end, I know that one's going to be hard to read, but especially with the stained glass coming in, but I'll tell you what it says. But this is the one that actually got amended and then approved. And so it's disaffiliation of local churches over issues related to human sexuality. So it's not just any church that wants to exit for any reason. It's specifically if they choose to exit or leave the denomination because of something related to human sexuality. And it's only good for a period of time. So on December 31st, 2023, this expires, which means churches would have to make this decision within that time frame in order for this to be the process that is followed and the consequences to it.
Did I read that it had to be finished by 2023 as well?
I think that's right.
I think that's true.
So first, 2/3 of a church conference have to make the decision. But it doesn't, so 2/3 of a church conference has to agree to it. Now, the original legislation did not include that the annual conference has to pass it. This was a decision by the Judicial Council that was a little bit unexpected. The legislation didn't say anything about the annual conference also having to ratify the decision. And so some people thought it would be determined unconstitutional because our Book of Discipline requires that the annual conference act on any church that wants to leave the denomination. But what the Judicial Council said in a lot of paragraphs, basically, is that because the Book of Discipline already indicates that that's a requirement for a church to leave, that even though this legislation didn't include it, it's already part of our polity, and therefore it can kind of be added into or interpreted as part of this process as well. So if a church conference decided they wanted to leave the denomination by at least a 2/3 vote, then the annual conference by majority vote has to also agree to it and make that decision. Annual conference trustees determine the terms and the conditions in consultation with some others, and it listed all these other people that it would be in consultation with, consistent with these provisions. The GCFNA will develop a standard form, and I understand that just came out yesterday. I haven't seen it, but I heard from an annual conference treasurer that they have done that work, and the annual conference treasurers have received that form. But an annual conference can add to the terms. So like Jennifer said related to Westpath earlier, annual conference can add terms to the exit plan, but these are and that's true about everything in the Book of Discipline. Those are like minimum standards, but then an annual conference can add to the standards. So for example, Board of Ordained Ministry can add to the requirements for ordination. The Book of Discipline gives the minimum, and then a conference board can add to it. The same is true for this. The church shall pay unpaid apportionments for the previous 12 months and an additional 12 months. So if you have any unpaid apportionments for the last 12 months, you have to pay up, and you have to pay your apportionments for the next 12 months. The church retains its real and personal, tangible and intangible property. So that's the key, that in this plan, the church keeps its property and its debt. Pension liabilities, and the church can continue as a plan sponsor. So that's really part of the Westpath stuff Jennifer already said. The church is responsible for debts, loans, and liabilities, and payment is by the date of departure. And so I guess you can't set up a payment plan with a conference. You have to be ready to pay the full amount that's owed at the point the church is ready to leave. And this came into effect immediately. So this is already under effect. And then the last slide, the central conferences have some flexibility in how it gets implemented. This one, I'd be glad to send you the slideshow if you want it. You could just give me your email afterwards. I'd be glad to give you the whole thing. So that doesn't really affect us, and I don't totally understand it because central conferences meet at different times than our United States annual conferences do. There was some need for some flexibility there, and the last piece of legislation we passed just allowed for that. It doesn't affect us in the United States, and people were good with it. It passed pretty easily, but that was the last decision that was made.
Basically gives them another year beyond our next general conference in 2020 to institute any of these so that they can match up with the patterns and the calendars for them. Just going back on the disaffiliation petition for a minute, it says that Westpath can still be the plan sponsor of the church's pension liabilities as well as the clergy's accounts and that kind of thing. What that means is that Westpath can still administer them. They can take care of them for the church as well as for the clergy without them having to go find another place and hopefully another church plan so that it doesn't have some of the ERISA laws and things like that would go if you went to just say an Edward Jones or a T. Rowe Price or anybody else that could set up a pension plan. Things are already there, already set up for you. And because that church may still be affiliated in some way to a church with a Wesleyan heritage, that doesn't become a conflict. They just separate the money for that church, and it sits over here in its own separate little pool. So just so you know. So from here, this is more just what did we sense? What did we see from different perspectives as sitting there at the table together as General Conference went on? So I just put down a few bullet points just of what I thought about it. I was telling Kim yesterday that whenever I left General Conference, was sitting on the airplane, I just started kind of that brain dump. Just what happened, what do I remember on my computer as I flew home? And this is some of that and some of what's happened since. But the first thing that came to mind is like, we really just sat through a historic time of our church. We were trying to figure out a way that we could truly live together with this type of situation over human sexuality that many people we can't agree on. So it was, how can we make this happen? It's never happened that even a General Conference had asked the bishops to be a part of General Conference. Usually when they're there, all they do is sit up, as the bishops say, we sit up on the stage and look pretty. They don't get to vote. They have no control over the petitions or what happens. So they just have to wait for the 864 of us who are sitting on the floor to make the decisions. This was the first time we asked them to be a part of that process and actually give us something that we could work with. So it was definitely a historic time. And so you felt that burden on your shoulders already. I think beyond that, we truly discovered the global nature of the United Methodist Church. I think we'd always talked about it. We always knew about it. But when the African United Methodists, and I got to know more of them through this General Conference, they are passionate about their church. Many times we talk about the U.S. really has all of the money that we helped fund so many things in the central conferences. Just because of the way they only provide 2% of our apportionments, we provide 98%. But I heard one person say, we don't care about the money. If we need to do something, we'll do it. But we care about our church, and this is the way we are. So there was a much bigger voice and a much bigger presence for me in hearing that at this particular conference. And as many will say, as we went through the time period, as the way the votes came through. It was mentally and physically exhausting for those 4 days and the days thereafter, because we saw the good and the bad through that whole process, this legislative process that feels very broken. Especially in the last 3 general conferences I've attended, it feels very broken. We call ourselves Christians, we call ourselves United Methodists, but there was behavior even before and after. Things were said that leads into the next point, where both sides, if you want to call them sides, just perspectives, but we're all United Methodists, and I think all of us were harmed in some way or another. Some of it more visibly, but whenever the more traditional conservative side of the church becomes being called hateful and racist, so to speak, and not allowing people and not loving people, and just, it hurts, because it's truly purposeful mischaracterizations, as one person has put it, of things that have been said. And I think Kim would, I think she's going to say the same thing on this particular point, but we actually have started looking like the world. We've become more comparable to the world than the church in the world, and showing them a better way. As far as the conference, as you step back, we asked for a way forward. We put forth a way forward. We just didn't change our stance much in the United Methodist Church. We added some more provisions around what we had, but really didn't change our stance. For me, many times it felt like General Conference, as I have stepped back, was set up as a win-lose proposition. One side would win, the other side would lose. But that's not where we really got to. I think we have really, truly ended up with a lose-lose encounter, where we know we want to go forward with mission and ministry, but we can't quite figure out how. And we have harmed each other so much through this whole process, through the legislative part of it, through the things that have been said, that somehow we're going to have to show the world and each other that we truly do love each other. We're not trying to segregate anybody and keep people out. We still love everybody and want everybody in our church. But it looks to the world as if we are kind of in a mockery ourselves. It's like, well, how do you know what you believe in if you're going through all this fighting? So I see that as a lose-lose encounter. Through the last several weeks now that we've come this far away from General Conference, the more I read, the more I hear from various groups and perspectives, I come to the realization, and as one person put it, that the UMC may work for our mission and ministry a whole lot better if we were in different rooms of the same house, kind of with new expressions of Methodism, how we want to go forward. I know I've seen that in some of the information coming out of Adam Hamilton, which I think we'll talk about a little bit later, and just other folks. I think it was even mentioned in Bishop Carter's Council of Bishops address that I was reading, that he gave a couple of days ago to the Council of Bishops meeting that's going on right now in Chicago. So I hope that that's not it, but maybe that's where we work best together, to stay in mission and ministry and really grow this church. But last and above all, I look to the verse of Jeremiah 29:11, where the Lord says, I know the plans I have for you, a future with hope. So for me, as I stated here, and I stated this when we were at General Conference, I stated it to our church when we got back, God is still in control. All are still welcome in the United Methodist Church, and in each of our churches here and around the country, we still are in mission and ministry to our communities, expressing the love of God to all who want and need it. And that's the biggest part of who we are as United Methodists, not all this legislation that we fight over.
Okay, now I'll share my observations and then some implications. So I would say that we're still in an impasse, that the hope was for a way forward there was a hope for some that the way forward would look different than the way in the past did. And it doesn't really, and as a result of there not really being any change, then there's still an impasse, and we'll talk a little bit more about what that looks like. That a lot of people, including the bishops, feel that there's just significant distrust of bishops, and the reason for that, or what that looks like, is that the bishops did intervene. They formed a commission. The commission worked diligently. We talked about that last time, to come up with these plans. And then those plans, the one that the majority of the bishops supported, wasn't approved, and so it felt to them that people didn't trust the bishops. People would say, and bishops would say, it's like they trust their own bishop, but they don't trust the bishops collectively. There's an inability for jurisdictions to respond to their context or make decisions specific to their needs. So it was well thought. It was thought, even though we don't know who voted how. The votes at General Conference in 2019 mirrored the votes in General Conference of 2016. And it's pretty well thought that 2/3 of the U.S. delegation voted for the one church plan. And so that it looked like the majority of the United States did want change, did want something that looked different. And so the answer to that really ended up being that the jurisdictions, which are the United States United Methodist Church, I'll remind you of that. We have 5 jurisdictions in the United States. They're geographical. We're in the southeastern jurisdiction. Outside of the United States, they're called central conferences. So the jurisdictions feel like, at least some of them feel like that they're still not able to minister in their context in the ways that they would want to. A real, I don't know, revelation might be too strong of a word, but for me, through the conversations and especially through the emails that we received as delegates ahead of time, revealed to me that we don't have kind of a common understanding of how we regard Scripture. Kind of the authority of Scripture versus the interpretation of Scripture. How do we understand Scripture? In a lot of ways, it felt like people were beating you over the head with the Bible, figuratively, obviously not literally. And that we've made, in some places and in some cases, we've made Scripture an idol. And so that we need to do some work in the United Methodist Church over how kind of Wesley taught us to interpret Scripture. And then kind of the same with the theological task and the quadrilateral. So in the Book of Discipline, which I highly encourage you to get, there is a section, which is kind of the historical section, about how we understand theology, how we understand how God works in the world, about grace and about Wesleyan emphases, and all of this is in our Book of Discipline. I mean, you could read it in other books too, but it's just really succinct in a few pages in our Book of Discipline. And how we understand the Wesleyan quadrilateral, Scripture, reason, tradition, and experience. And I read it and studied it before General Conference for a presentation that I had to do, and it felt like we, as a collective denomination, haven't really studied and read and lived out of what it means to take a Wesleyan approach to understanding theology. So that was kind of an observation for me. I will say that coming out of it, if you followed it closely, there were a lot of accusations about bribes to the African delegations, particularly maybe some to the delegates from the Philippines, but primarily from the Africans. But my observation was they voted what they believed. There were some inappropriate things, I think. There were some things that were probably really bad ideas that happened, but I don't think it changed people's minds. The Africans were true to what they believe, what they understand, what their kind of theology is, and they voted according to their conscience and their beliefs. And as Jennifer said, it really mirrors where we are in a country. And unfortunately, our next General Conference, our normal ones are always on presidential election years. And it just makes it all the worse that we're doing presidential elections in our country at the same time we're doing General Conference in our church. But we'll do that again in 2020. As far as some implications, so there again, these are my kind of interpretation of what I think. I think that we are going to limit to some degree our diversity of thought, that as we kind of narrow down how we express our understanding of things, that it does limit kind of the diversity of thought and the breadth of thought that we have really embraced as a Wesleyan denomination for many years. It also can limit and may limit our diversity of membership in particular ways, not only that LGBTQ people feel harmed, and while we do say we love and we welcome everybody, we have to acknowledge that there are people who don't feel loved and welcomed. They don't feel that they can fully express who they are and live out their call to ministry and live out their connection and their relationships and live out kind of covenant relationships within the United Methodist Church, and they feel harmed by that. And therefore, as we may lose people either who are LGBTQ or their allies, then that begins to limit the diversity within our membership. And that kind of gets at the next one, the feeling of not being included. It may affect our future leaders. One of the kind of neat things that happened at General Conference was that overnight, in a matter of hours, 15,529 young people signed a statement. I'm going to say that number again. In a matter of less than 12 hours, 15,529 young people signed a statement. Like, that just says a lot about technology. I mean, kind of in and of itself, how the word can get out that expansively. But signed a statement that said, we don't agree on this, because it was global, and even the young people don't agree on it, but they hoped for kind of a movement forward. But there may be implications with our campus ministries, with our boards of ordained ministry and conference leadership, our clergy. I mean, we don't know what the implications of that are going to be in our future leaders. Finances and apportionments, one of the ways that churches will respond. They would have if it had gone the other way as well, but churches may respond will be in their giving, and they'll express their dissatisfaction with the decision in the way they give their apportionment funds.
Can I add something there?
Sure.
Right first? Because this was more of as the conference treasurer, I dealt with this all the time. And we did see, even back when I was the conference treasurer, how some people would reallocate, so to speak, their apportionments when they paid all the money in. But I'm hearing more and more stories of this across the denomination, across basically the U.S. conferences are the ones I hear it from, is that they truly are starting to withhold the monies. This is going to impact, and already is starting to have the conversation of impacting at all of the general agencies who rely upon that money coming in to do their work. Many people are putting those monies in escrow. If I remember correctly, Adam with the Church of the Resurrection said that they were going to take half of their monies and put it in escrow, although paying the other half in to their conference so that it can be used for the mission and ministry. I know in our church, we kind of looked at our church and said, no, we don't. They asked, should we go ahead and cut off our apportionments? We said, no, we need to be faithful to God and continue our tithing. And that's kind of the church's tithing into God's work at the conference to be used for the global church. So no, we're not going to stop our apportionments. So we took a different stance at our church to do it that way rather than saying we're going to stop this. But many churches are doing that.
Another implication, marriages and weddings. So I know one church in the annual conference, even before General Conference, said we won't do any weddings. If we can't do weddings of gay persons, we won't do any weddings in our church. So there are some of those kind of implications. Our colleges, universities, and seminaries, I saw last week that one of our United Methodist colleges has already disaffiliated and is no longer going to claim to be United Methodist. I actually had the opportunity to read a statement. So the way it worked is through this electronic system, the bishop who was presiding chose who got to speak at any given time. So there were several of us who had the statement ready to read, but I happened to be the one that got chosen. And I'm on the university synod is why I was one of those. But it was a statement from the presidents of our seminaries that just talked about the implications of what this might mean in our United Methodist seminaries and our future leaders. The presidents of our United Methodist colleges had put out a statement prior to General Conference about really all of this was supporting the one church plan with a hope for more inclusion. So some of those implications are yet to be determined. And then our regard for one another, and that's kind of what Jennifer referenced, is that that there were reactions that weren't kind, that weren't loving and weren't helpful, and some of that will just continue to be the case. Now, I will say, and this is the last observation I'm going to make, is that if you were watching it, What I have discovered after I came home is that and this was my experience, it wasn't certainly everybody's experience, that I was so involved in the process of what was going on, and I was on these apps and I was getting, messages and things like that. I was so engaged in the process that it did not feel as painful and as hateful as it appeared to people who were on TV. I could see the strategy going on. I saw the conversations about why people would say what they were saying. Really, it was kind of like filibuster. It's the same kind of stuff I think that goes on in our government. The places where I was broken, or the times when I was brokenhearted, I discovered was in worship. That's when, and I'm a head person anyway. My husband will tell you I don't feel very well, or very much. But it's really in worship where I began to feel the experience of what was going on. While we were voting and doing all of that, my experience was that I was trying to figure all that out. But if you were watching it from home, apparently it just felt really, really rough. And I would say it didn't feel that much different than all the other general conferences that I've been a part of. And so I think for that reason, it didn't feel, but a lot of people watched this as their first one. And indeed, it would have seemed to be really rough if it had been the first one that you had experienced.
I'll add to that, because from the protest side of it, there were a couple of things that happened on the floor. And I know the last day was whenever one of the delegations had walked up towards the stage trying to take the cross off the altar. But the bishop who was presiding is a very small, petite woman, but she carries a big voice. And all I heard was, "What are you doing over there?" And I saw that hand fly out. She says, "You put that back down right now." They did, I assure you. But we also had a very strong security presence with this general conference that I had never truly seen before. And I think that helped shadow us or keep us away from much of the protest that was going on. We were in the former Rams Stadium there in St. Louis. So we were down basically on the field, so to speak. And everybody that was observers, where most of the protests were coming from, was in the mezzanine level above us. So we could hear a lot of it, but couldn't really see a lot of it. More of the protests they would have were outside. And I remember the last day when they dismissed all of us, the observers had gone out into the main hall where we would actually have come through in the morning. And they were doing their protests there. But there was a bank of doors that would shut off that main hall from where we had to come down to go through turnstiles and our badge checks to get onto the, quote, field. They ushered us out a whole different exit that day. I've also was looking and have had the experience of some inside knowledge, so to speak, but I know we had a heavy police presence around us at all times. We could see it going into and out of the buildings as we came through. So I think that helped kind of minimize some of the protest part for what we experienced compared to past general conferences that we've been in.
And yet it was a terrible witness. So there was a volleyball tournament going on in another part
Yes.
of the convention center, kind of next to us. So there were all these young people and their families coming and going as a part of this volleyball tournament. They were all in our hotels. And it was a terrible witness to what it means to be the church, that we need police and guards in order to keep things safe and secure to these other people who were in the area. And that was just really unfortunate that that's how I guess it needed to be. The last slide is just kind of what's going on now. So there are these different groups that formed ahead of General Conference but continue to meet and talk with one another about what's next. It's really uncertain. So the Uniting Methodist, Mainstream Methodist, Centrist Methodists are the group that would be considered kind of on the progressive or left center and left. The WCA, the Wesleyan Covenant Association, is the group that under that comes the Good News Movement, the Confessing Movement, and some of the others, and they're the ones that would be considered more conservative in kind of traditional ways of talking about it. There are groups that are beginning to meet that are very public in news service that you would see more information about. Adam Hamilton, Jennifer's referenced that a couple times, is providing a lot of leadership, and so there were meetings in Dallas and Atlanta, small groups of people, and at the end of this month, There will be 10 people from every annual conference, so they're looking at about 600 people to come. And then at Church of the Resurrection's annual event, which they do every fall, they're looking for 200 people from every annual conference. And those are really what we would have called before General Conference compatibilists, traditional compatibilists and progressive compatibilists, people who would like the church kind of to stay together but to allow for more inclusion. That's the direction that group of people is trying to figure out what's next for that to happen. And it's really uncertain to me what that looks like. There are a lot of options, and it's really uncertain what that looks like. But then we'll have a 2020 General Conference in May of 2020 in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and we will vote at this annual conference meeting in June to who Western North Carolina's delegates will be, 10 lay and 10 clergy again to go to that meeting. So that's kind of what's next. I know we're past 8. I think she had originally said we could go to 8:15, but it won't hurt our feelings if you need to be somewhere. The Amazing Race doesn't come on till 9, so as long as you don't live too far away, then you're okay to get home still in time for that.
Interestingly enough, one of the questions that we've entertained here, I think on a number of occasions at a number of these meetings, had to do with how are local churches represented. And obviously when we had you and other Jennifers here, we talked about that in terms of who represents the local church, and that's represented at annual conference. At annual conference, prior to general conference, we elect delegates, both clergy and laity, and they're the ones who not only represent local churches from which they come, but they also represent the annual conference that elected them. So if you could take a moment and kind of reiterate that, so that this year at this annual conference, we will elect clergy and lay delegates for the 2020 general conference. You all may have caught it or not, but at the 2016 general conference, those delegates having been elected, since this was a first time for us as United Methodists, there was no provision that I know of in between general conferences to elect delegates for a special called general, because we hadn't had one. And so people were asking, how do we get to be representative of the annual conference? So could you give them, the ones who are here, just a quick overview of how that happens?
You want to talk about it?
I can do that. And I guess it's different with the laity and the clergy. We, as laity, actually provide, I guess it's a self-nomination form, for lack of a better way to describe it, just to tell a little bit about who we are so that we put ourselves up for election. You can still add in other people from the laity side. The clergy kind of pick their own. Everybody on the slate of deacons and elders is open for election. And they lift up those names. Now, I think a lot of them probably talk along the way to see who might be interested, so that you don't, try to push in a whole bunch at one time and then everybody says, no, I don't want to do it, and then you have to start over again. I'm guessing that's the way it is. But from there, as far as representation, once you've selected who will go, those 10 clergy, 10 laity, we're not set apart with our rules and regulations of the annual conference to say that we will vote in a certain manner. I think it's more of a personal choice as to how you look at it. I know from my perspective, I look at our annual conference to see how we have voted, what I hear from the laity of our annual conference, and even from the clergy, although I represent the laity side more than the clergy side. And then try to take that along with how do I feel about what has been said and what these petitions say. But then first and foremost, I make my decisions with very prayerful intention. So I will talk to God a lot through the process to try to figure out what should we be doing as best for our church. But using what our conference has historically done through the annual conferences. Being there, you kind of watch the votes and see what people say and talk to folks and go from there. The clergy side might be, I don't know how, if they're pretty much in the same boat as we are in looking at it that way. So if you had anything to add.
Yeah, so I guess I would just say that the clergy primarily, so the clergy know the clergy better than the laity know the laity. And so the clergy probably, you could say, are voting for the people most likely that they feel like represent what they believe or what they would want to have happen. And it's obviously not just about LGBTQ. There are all kinds of things that are discussed. There's legislation about potential changes. So just who do they think best represents them? The laity have a harder time doing that from the same perspective because they don't know all of the people who have put their names forth in the same kind of way or know as much about them. Not that all clergy know all clergy, but it's just more likely that you know something about people.
So therefore, the laity have to be a little more intentional about talking to folks and meeting with folks, not organized type things, but if you're in a district meeting and you can talk to people near you or with everybody that's in a district meeting that you might go to, that kind of thing.
Because that question came up the night that Kim and Jennifer Davis were here in terms of people trying to understand that as we elect clergy and as we elect laity, each from their own group, I think people were trying to make the comparison to government. So a lot of questions centered around do candidates, if we want to use that word, do candidates for election have a platform, or do they publish, if elected, I agree to represent this? And the answer is by and large no. And even if they did, they are not bound, unless by ethics or morals of their own conscience, they are not really bound to represent a particular position. And I think that's hard to understand from secular government, where we're used to people saying, if elected, this is kind of my platform, this is what I represent. And that this is one of those ways in which our structure is a bit different than our secular governmental structure is. People don't typically lay out a position paper, although some have, I've seen over the years. But by and large, even if they do, they're not bound to that technically when they go to general conference representing people. So thanks for that clarification.
I will say, I went to a West Path board meeting last week, and we're talking to several of my cohorts around the conferences around the country, and several of them are getting phone calls, possibly from the conference, possibly from other leaders in their conference, saying, okay, which side are you on? Are you a progressive or are you conservative? Or are you in the middle? That kind of thing. So we have specifically, I think, in our rules, so to speak, they're not necessarily bound and set in stone, that we're not going to be asking those questions. We leave it with what's printed in the book, and we go from there.
And we've had 68 laity put their names forth for consideration, and we will post online the biographical sketches that they have submitted about a month before annual conference starts, so within the next couple weeks.
If it's okay with the two of you, if you're ready to take some questions, you've shared a lot of information, so take some water. But a lot of that's hard to process unless you're, an insider in the church and all this language makes sense. But we will, to the best of our ability, try to answer your questions. So there are 2 microphones down here that Joel has live, and so if you'd like to come up and ask some questions, you can come to one of the microphones if you'll just tell us who you are. And that'll help in case of not having an answer for you that we need to get back to you. We can capture that information. So anyone with a question, please come up and we'll do our best to field that.
Hello, I'm David Wheeler. Thank you all for your representation and for being here tonight. I just had a question. You all are talking about consulting with God and being in prayer. As you prepared for this with the General Conference, did you or did any of the other delegates that you know from the Western Conference talk to any of the gay Christians that are in our churches or in our pulpits? Did you consult with any sort of impact, what this might have on them? If so, how did that influence how you chose to vote? And if not, was there a reason why not?
So we had delegation meetings in preparation for General Conference. We met a number of times. And one of the things we did intentionally as a delegation is invited a guest in. We did it on 3 occasions to talk about how it would affect or impact them or their families. And one was a woman who's a United Methodist in one of our churches whose son had committed suicide after publicly identifying as gay. Another was... and I missed this meeting, but it was a man who fell on the more conservative traditional side and talked about his beliefs and how it would affect his church membership and participation. And then another was a woman who grew up in the United Methodist Church and became an Episcopal priest because she was gay, and there wasn't a place for her in our denomination. So those were the 3 stories that we heard as a delegation. Now, personally, I have friends who are gay. I have what was for me an interesting number of clergy who have children who are LGBTQ, and so talking to them about how it would affect them and their families. And I feel like I can say that everybody in their own ways or in their own personal kind of conversations had those kind of interactions, and then have read books and gotten other kind of input that way.
I would definitely agree. We also did some of the same process through the 16 delegation, running up to the 16 General Conference session as well, where we had an additional number of people on both sides come and speak to us. I know we actually had both sides represented at one meeting that we had, so that we could talk amongst ourselves with them and hear both their stories as they were both there. So that was helpful. And again, like Kim said, for me too, I've got family and friends on both sides of the equation that definitely would talk to and just have good open conversations with when they're folks that you know that close.
Thank
I'll
you.
also add that Adam Hamilton, everybody knows, well, not necessarily, a lot of people know who Adam Hamilton is, so he gets identified. He's not in this alone, but the groups that or the conversations that he's organizing have been very intentional at having LGBTQ persons participate, having persons of color participate, and having young people's voices participate. So I'd heard yesterday on a phone call the numbers, but I didn't write them down, of representation in the group that's coming in May to that. In those three categories in particular, they've been very intentional about that.
Thank you.
Thank you, David.
Hi, thank you for being here. I'm Scott Putnam. And I guess the response to the General Conference vote has been, well, I don't know whether it's anticipated or expected, but certainly it's had an impact with people withdrawing apportionments, withholding those, and then also with 2/3 of the U.S. delegation, really favoring the one church plan. And now with Adam Hamilton putting together not just a small group of churches, but reaching out to all the annual conferences, where do you see this headed to the General Conference 2020? If it took them 2 or 3 days or 4 to look at the petitions or the recommendations from the Council of Bishops, then with all the other legislation and considerations they would have, how does this fit in to that General Conference? And how do you see that moving forward? Whatever comes from Adam Hamilton's group is a better way forward.
I'll start, and if you got more. With any general conference, any of this could come back to the table.
Right.
Because all you have to do is put a petition in for a particular paragraph. I don't know that I could say with, looking into the crystal ball exactly how this will play out at General Conference. I am sure we will have petitions surrounding what happened with the 19 General Conference, whether it may be petitions to try to go ahead and continue to perfect what wasn't constitutional within the original traditional plan, or whether it is another petition and proposition for another expression of Methodism that may come out of the Adam Hamilton meetings and those meetings with leaders and the bishops and with others. I know or have heard that even behind the scenes that many of the leaders from all across the perspectives have been talking some as well. So it's right now, I think it's still early to say what we think might, for me, early to say what might come through. I know even people have made the comment that really the one in 2024 in Manila may be the one that's going to be the most historical behind the 1968 conference, because that may be the one that we're going to split on, sign all the papers. I hope that's not the case. I really do. Surely somewhere we can come up with something.
If there was a recommendation for the 2020 conference for either some folks, I guess what I've read, want to continue to oppose the ruling by maybe allowing same-gender marriages and withholding apportionments. There's another group who truly want to separate from the church in much the same way that you talked about, maybe in different rooms of the same home. But so how, if something like that came forward at 2020, that would be fairly significant, I think, in relation to all the other business that would be before the church. And so how do you think that might be addressed if that in fact were one of the recommendations or petitions?
So legislation's due September 15th, I believe. So I don't think anything's going to come out of Adam Hamilton's group's conversations that will actually get to General Conference 2020, because that big group conversation isn't till late September. They will have missed the deadline for legislation. So that's kind of one thing. And I think there are a lot of people who think General Conference can't make this happen. If anything's going to change toward inclusion of some sort, it's not going to happen at General Conference. So I'm not sure there are a lot of people, and I'm just speaking from what I've read or kind of heard, that are putting their eggs back in the General Conference basket. That those eggs are going in other baskets and these other conversations and other ways to make something happen. Because I think that's what 2019 told us, is it's not going to happen at General Conference. So at annual conference, we have 8 petitions, and 4 or 5 of them are around homosexuality. And a couple of those are, maybe only one of them, maybe 2 of them, are petitions that the annual conference will decide whether we send legislation to the General Conference. And one of those would be, and these will all be in print maybe by the end of next week, but would make all of the jurisdictions kind of their own central conference. And so if our and even if our annual conference doesn't decide to send it to General Conference, the writer of the petition can send it to General Conference, because anybody can send something to General Conference. So that would be an attempt at looking at a different structure, and I do think there will be that kind of thing at General Conference, but not out of Adam Hamilton's group.
There's also the whole premise that the different books of discipline that will come before 2020 and the work that the connectional table's doing that relates to the Central Conference idea as part of the U.S., as us becoming our own or separate ones. So there's a lot of different pieces that are at play that have been coming forward, but then 2019 kind of got in front of it, so to speak. But any conference legislation that comes in to us, all of them will be treated the same, no matter if it was a plan for dissolution or something that kept us all together. One of the things we passed in 2016 said that any piece of legislation has to be looked at and voted upon in legislative committee, and anything that comes out of legislative committee has to be voted upon before we leave General Conference. So everything will be treated the same as far as that goes, to be looked at and determined what to do with. We're still a little up in the air. It's an excellent question. I wish we had a better answer.
Thank you, Scott.
You'll be fine. I will take you up on the PowerPoint because I'm reporting back to our Sunday school class that's very active. For some of us, it's hard for us to wrap our heads around the beginning of how was traditional even chosen. And so I think that's where we're getting stuck to even process the rest of it. Pastor Chuck came to our Sunday school class, and a lot of the answer is Africa. A lot of it came from the international vote, even though 2/3 of America chose. And for anybody interested, when you were talking about the interpretation of Bible verses, Pastor Chuck has a fantastic essay where he has taken the verses that are often used against homosexuality and how he might interpret them. So I would definitely say reach out to him if you want to read it. So my question is, can you, in a very brief overview, kind of help us understand how traditional was even the one that made it through? Because I think that's where the sticking point is of how could that possibly have even been the one that was thought of as the good idea?
Probably the hardest thing to do is try to explain how you believe something that someone else doesn't. So that first is, it's just kind of the mental side of that. But for the traditionalist group where I fall, we believe that what has been written in the Bible regarding homosexuality is truly what was meant by homosexuality. That marriage is truly between a man and a woman. Now, that doesn't say that we push everything aside beyond that, But we hold that belief and that authority of the Scripture to say that that's what we believe was meant, going even down through the ages into the New Testament when Paul talks about personal holiness, when John Wesley brings up personal holiness, etc. So from there, that belief is held by part of the United Methodist Church in the U.S. Definitely the African continent is strongly traditional, and a lot of that is based on their culture, because there are a number of countries whether it is either illegal to have a homosexual relationship or you can be killed because of it under their laws. So they are very much in the traditional bucket, and that's how they believe in that continent. So as he says, it's the African vote, it's the African vote. When that comes together as the whole global church, and the Africans with that traditional belief hold, I think 38% of the vote and climbing in 2019 and 2016, that overwhelmingly then brings with just a small part of the U.S. that majority, a close majority, but still a majority. Like I said, I don't know how I can explain to say this is how we believe as a traditionalist group. That is what we believe. We don't believe that it was kind of dismissed by Jesus, even though Jesus said we love all. We believe that too. But we still believe in the sanctity of marriage between a man and a woman in looking at all of the scriptures together.
And it might be helpful too as a part of this, Amanda, because I think part of the question has to do with, if you look at the worldwide church and you know that 860, 70 delegates represented the worldwide United Methodist Church that are in pockets in Africa and Asia and the Philippines, different places. The selection method for annual conferences, or in the case of outside the central conferences, the process, the formula for selecting delegates is apportioned identically. So it's not based on money, it's based on numbers and members and clergy and those kinds of things. And so I think part of your answer might be that of those 860 delegates, those are representative equally based on the same criteria around the world. So the simple answer is that means that then roughly a majority or more of the total population of annual conferences who sent general conference delegates, then a majority of those delegates at general conference chose the traditional plan, and the other number would have chosen the one church model. So that's kind of underneath part of what they're saying. So I'll let Kim speak, but that might be.
The only other thing I would
helpful.
say, and it's not an answer to your question, but it's an interesting thing about our denomination, is that in the Book of Discipline, there's a page that talks about the general Book of Discipline. General or global?
Global.
Global Book of Discipline, they're going to proposing to call it a general Book of Discipline, but that allows the central conferences to adapt it according to their own needs and their own context. So the Book of Discipline is adaptable, much of it, in the central conferences. So to me, the harder thing is that 40% of the people voting were voting for things that only the United States had to abide by. And that is our polity, but it's an interesting polity.
Hey, yeah, my name is Frank, and my question is, from my understanding from a lot of the conversations we've been having over the past 2 years, was that the One Church plan had accommodations for both the traditional and more progressive, let's say, viewpoints. And is it a case where, let's say, the African delegation or other delegates did not have a full understanding of how that accommodation would work for all, as opposed to being, I think to a lot of us it feels like it was very dictatorial, like my way or the highway, kind of forcing a traditional plan when it could have been more accommodating for the idea of being in different rooms, but we can still maintain that covenant kind of relationship between each other in more of a compatibilist sort of fashion. And I just wanted to get your perspective of why was that not communicated better, maybe, with other delegates? And I think that's also contributing why I'm kind of confused as to why wasn't that more preferable to work together as opposed to force one view on everybody?
Maybe I'll speak first so that Jennifer can make it sound better. So my observation, my kind of experience, so this is just purely coming from me, is that there wasn't a sense of compromise or contextualization. That I don't think it was a misunderstanding. Now, I'll say that, and this is, so I said before, I don't think the African delegates were manipulated. You will hear stories that they were given money, their votes were bought. I don't really think that's true. And I will say that there was a gathering of the of some representation of the African delegates back in August in Africa. It was organized by an African initiative or something, but it was led, because I saw the agenda, by the WCA. And so the WCA interpreted to the African delegates kind of, I think, what they understood about it. So I wouldn't necessarily say it was miscommunication. I would just say it was communicated in a particular way, probably.
Sounds like manipulation.
Well, I would not go as far as to call it manipulation. I do think it was interpretation. It was what certain people wanted to have happen, what they believed. The beliefs of everybody in the room probably were the same, and so it was presented from that perspective. Now, on the floor of General Conference, there certainly were speeches that made it clear what the implications would be in the United States. And everybody that doesn't speak English as their first language had interpretation in their headsets. So I just think specifically Africa feels very strongly about this, and feels very strongly it is wrong, and it's wrong everywhere. And there's not the room for us in the United States to think differently about it. That was my perspective. I would love for Jennifer to build on that.
I'm with Kim. I don't think there was any misunderstanding about how it was going to work, that it was supposed to have room for both in the One Church plan. Neither of us were at the African initiative, but I know I heard some of the African folks who were there and helped create that whole process of bringing those together. They preached that they were very much for the United Methodist Church with a conservative attitude towards marriage, that it was one man, one woman. In saying that, as they talked about the United Methodist Church, for them, the United Methodist Church is built on that belief in their continent, so that there is no room for anything else. No matter where you are, if it says it's the United Methodist Church, to be any different than that belief. So then when they come to General Conference, and even though we say that this is more of a U.S. issue, and they realize that, then they still have, but it's still the United Methodist Church, even if it's there and not with us, that are doing these things. And it still needs to be traditional. Now, from the other side of that in the U.S., I know that's well-intentioned and well-known by our pastors here as to how this was going to be with the One Church plan with room for both. But many people thought that felt somewhat hypocritical. How can we be the same church but have two different beliefs as part of our doctrine? How does that fit in? If we set the discipline like this, and this is what we said we were going to uphold, but we're not doing that anymore, where is the loyalty of our oath to what we said in our ordination or in our licensing or in our commissioning? So it became a struggle internally for those pastors who are much more on the traditional and conservative thought process of man and woman as marriage. That's what I have heard and understand that really brought that to light.
Thank you for the insight.
Thanks, sir. Other questions?
have a question. How do you consider a gay a Christian? We have walked in the ashes of Sodom and Gomorrah, and I don't believe that God recognizes a gay that has not been converted, that hasn't given up that type of that life. I think it's a oxymoron to refer to a gay as Christian. Am I wrong?
You said you've walked in the ashes of what?
Sorry?
Of Sodom and Gomorrah. I'm sorry, I just I couldn't understand what you said. So I'll just speak briefly to that because we could be here all night with difference of opinion, but I feel like I have to say something. And so a Christian is somebody who believes in Jesus Christ as the Son of God and is their Savior, and that's what makes somebody a Christian. A gay person is someone, and I think science has predominantly proven, and many, if not most, gay people would tell you that they were created that way. It's not a choice, it's who they are, it's who they've been created to be, and therefore, and they were created by their Creator, by God, to be that way. And so I think they would not find it as an oxymoron because their belief in the one who created them and loves them and called them into a relationship with God, it is all whole and complete. It doesn't differentiate, kind of in a nutshell.
And I'll add to that from a different perspective, but I feel like there can be a gay Christian. It's not an oxymoron. I've ran into a number of people who say that, yes, I am a homosexual, gay, lesbian, whatever, whichever side of that coin you want to be, but homosexual. And as they learned more about Jesus and accepted Jesus for that salvation, they realized this is not the behavior I should be exhibiting. They still have that nature and will tell you they're homosexual, but they have made the choice to remain celibate, to not give in to that will that they have and that attraction to a same-sex person, and are truly trying to follow Jesus' example to be the Christian and to have the salvation which Jesus freely gives to all of us. So therefore, I think, yes, there can be a homosexual Christian in this world.
I guess, I don't know if it's a question or comment, but the verbiage about practicing homosexual, and I think you just touched to that. I guess it just, for me, my mind goes to like, is this whole discussion kind of opening up Pandora's box? Are we going to explore sexuality in heterosexual couples? Are you know, is everything by the book? If you have committed adultery, are we going to have a conference about how we're going to handle those members of the church? Are they welcome anymore? And I know we're saying that people are still welcome, but maybe they wouldn't feel that way. So for me, I guess I struggle with how far are we going to take this? Like, how many conferences are we going to have where we dive into people's lives, whether they feel their choices or not, and say, well, you know, you did this or you did that, or you're, you know. And I use adultery as an example, but I mean, there are people that go to church and have done things like that. So,
Or divorce.
Or divorce.
The Bible
Exactly.
talks about
So
divorce.
Are we not
So
going to marry people that have done this and this and this, and are we going to?
we had those conversations on the floor. That's where it felt ugly if you were watching it, particularly ugly if you were watching it from afar. And if you were there, you kind of knew the points. I mean, you felt like you kind of knew the points that they were being made. But it was kind of about Scripture and how you interpret or how you pick and choose what you utilize in Scripture. But the Board of Ordained Ministry already has those conversations. If we're going to ask, you have to ask everybody something if you're going to ask one person something. And so if you're going to ask about your sexual practices, for example, you have to ask everybody about their sexual practices. And I dare say the Board of Ordained Ministry is not going to begin asking people about their sexual practices. It's just not a place they want to go.
But we are asking this other group about their sexual practices.
But there has to be, at least at that place, there has to be consistency across the board of how you treat that kind of question or inquiry. It's hard stuff, folks. And I appreciate that you're here to have these conversations, and we encourage you to have them amongst yourselves. We're going to try to offer some resources in the next year where, and you've already done some of this, but where churches, not just around LGBTQ persons, but around lots of things that are hard to talk about that seem to divide us in the secular world, but that we can learn to love and to live and to listen to one another in our churches so that we're not having to take sides and be divisive, but that we can stay together as the body of Christ. And so thank you for being willing to have those hard conversations and to listen to one another and to ask questions, trying to understand other perspectives. And it's hard to do, and we're really grateful that you're doing it, that you're trying.
One thing I'd like to do, in addition to thanking our speakers tonight and thanking you for coming in for the way that you always comport yourself, is to say that you're right. This is hard stuff, and that's probably an understatement. But one of the reasons tonight I think that has been good is, for me, it gives voice to what was so difficult to watch on the floor. And it didn't really matter which viewpoint, as you all both said. It was very hard to watch the live stream for parts of it that I got to see, just because it was so painful for everybody. And I think you're right, nobody left unscathed. But I think tonight, if nothing else, shows that we can, as United Methodists, hold very different opinions, still respect each other, but realize that this is just one of those issues. And so people can love each other and get along together, but we may never agree on some of these things. And so I do appreciate the fact that tonight it has felt very balanced in terms of nobody, no position, no interpretation was elevated or demonized, and I'm most appreciative of that, because it is much of the world to turn people into winners and losers in one side or another side. So thank you both for that. So, and thank you all for being here and for your continued participation and the good spirit with which you come. So would you, tonight as we close, and I'm going to do that in prayer in just a moment, would you thank our speakers tonight for being here with us?
Thank you.
If you would allow me the privilege, as is always my privilege as one of your clergy, to send us forth with God's blessing tonight, would you pray with me? Gracious and loving God, this is such a difficult time in the church, but there have always been difficult times and hard issues in the church. But God, we know that in everything, in all things, you are with us and you are moving us forward, and that it is not your will that we get lost sometimes in our own discussions and decisions and lose sight of the call that's ours to be at work in the world for the salvation of all people. So, God, whatever comes, may we always turn our eyes towards you. May we remember that John Wesley said, we may have differing opinions, in order to paraphrase for me, but if our hearts are the same and they beat together, then we can walk hand in hand, though we may not agree. So God, thank you tonight for our speakers, for their time, for the way they've graciously given that to us as a gift tonight, and for those who've come tonight and shared their opinions and heard information. I just give you thanks for this ability to be here together tonight, and pray your blessings on us now as we leave this place and go back to our homes, that we might get rest for this evening and rise refreshed, for tomorrow will bring its own challenges. But knowing that you're already there and already ahead of us, we will take our comfort from that tonight as we close our eyes in sleep and in prayer. So send us forth tonight with your blessing and your benediction upon us in your name. Amen. And if you do have any questions that didn't make it, you can come down and give those to us or give them to Teresa, and we'll do our best to get responses for you. And thank you again, folks, and good night.